My name is Brent Spencer. I've lived in Nebraska since 1992. Before that, I was living in California, teaching at Stanford University, and there was a pretty run-of-the-mill source of getting here. There was a job notice that Creighton University was looking for a writer, and I thought maybe they'll hire me. So I came and interviewed, and they had the bad fortune to to hire me. But my family's from southern Indiana, and I mostly grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, actually. So been around a bit. I attended a little college near my hometown in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Wilkes College, it's Wilkes University now. And then went to the University of Michigan for an MA in literary criticism, and then to Penn State for a PhD in modern American poetry, and then to the University of Iowa for an MFA in fiction writing, and then to Stanford for a kind of postdoctoral fellowship in creative writing. All kinds of writers, from Shakespeare to Chaucer to Raymond Carver, Tobias Wolff, Anne Lamott, all kinds of people. And then in Nebraska, as soon as I came to Nebraska, I began to meet Nebraska writers. The first one was Marley Swick, who's not born and bred here, but who was here at the time and who was I actually ran into her at a writer's colony in New Mexico. And she said, "You're on your way to Nebraska?" I happen to know what Nebraska's about. And so she gave me a wonderful introduction to the place and the people and the writers. And very quickly I got to know a lot of writers. So, but I'm a big fan of all of them, frankly. Bill Clefcorn's a wonderful poet who I have a great deal of admiration for. Ted Kooser, of course, is just amazing. Richard Duggan up at UNO is a wonderful fiction writer. Great colleague, over and over. In fact, I started a website for Nebraska writers, and I did it to teach myself web design. And I thought, how many Nebraska writers could there be, And there are, of course, hundreds, and even more when you count the long dead. And so it's been a long project for me, and it's still going strong, and I'm still every week, I guess, getting news of a new writer. And they're all in some form an influence to me too. They're just, I think and it's not just writers, it's Nebraska. There's a spirit that I recognize, frankly, that strikes me as kind of, I know there are people of all kinds in Nebraska, but there's a certain kind of working class mentality that I admire, sort of hard work, generosity, openness, lots of qualities that I kind of feel supported by from people wherever they are, and there just seems to be a higher percentage of those people here. I didn't think of myself as a writer, though I started writing when I was a teenager. What I was doing was venting about my quote-unquote terrible parents, and I didn't know what I was writing, whether it was a poem or a story or whatever. It was just anger. And I never thought of it as writing, frankly. I read a ton of books, but for some reason, I never really thought about books and writers as being connected in some way. I thought books just sprang up out of nowhere. And so it wasn't really until I got to college, I guess. In fact, I visited my little college across the river before I went there, and I was invited to a party of the literary magazine. And in a way, that's the first time I realized, these people wrote these poems and stories that are in this magazine, and I guess you could do that. In a way, I'm doing something like that. And so I went to that college and became part of that staff, and thought then, here are, here's what it means to be a writer, I guess. And I kind of liked it and did it to the point where I'm not good for anything else. Well, for one thing, in general, I'm very interested in people, and I'm interested in people under pressure, people on the edge in some way. I grew up in I was going to say what I normally say, which is a working class family, but we were frankly much poorer than that. So everyone I knew was on the edge in some way, economically or emotionally or something like that, on the verge of being thrown out of their houses and things like that. And I didn't realize that they became the kind of people I thought of as people I knew in some way and understood in some way. And though I never chose it consciously, it seemed to me that I'm always now writing about people who are under pressure, on the edge, various ways. But I guess I think you're kind of, it's not clear who you are as a person until you're under pressure. So that's why I'm interested when human character really comes out one way or the other, is when there's trouble brewing. You know, the working class and the pressure to make a living, that kind of thing. But I'm also interested in life in the country. I did some farming for a while, and I remember that fondly and also painfully, because I was not a good farmer, and it really took it out of me, and I admire those people and sometimes write about them. But mostly it's you know, I get tired of reading stories, sometimes I see in the New Yorker, for instance, where the characters don't seem to have jobs. They seem to be on a perpetual vacation. And in my world, people have to work. and that adds an extra pressure on them, as well as whatever emotional, social pressures there might be, economic. So you know, I'm just very interested in the kind of pressures that bear down on people and how they respond or don't respond to those pressures. And to me, that's interesting. For me, the best time to write is in the morning. First thing, before all of the demands of the day come, before the phone starts ringing. So for me, it's about 6 o'clock. I don't have a lot of discipline, but I have dogs, and that's when they get up, so I have to get up. Yeah, just get in as much work as I can from that point on. And then if I'm in the middle of a project, I can work for long stretches at various times of the day. But I feel like I'm freshest in that early morning. Later, I'm sort of better for revision. But my head is worn out usually by 11 or so, and I can't really write very well after that. When I think about style, I don't do anything consciously, or voice. I do something consciously about voice, I think, but style, for me, the word I always remember is from the Canadian writer Alice Munro. She said, you want in all cases for the story to get through the writing. So it's taken me a long time to try to not be flashy in the writing, try to let the writing kind of disappear and let the story come through. And I'm not sure I'm successful at that, but that's the thing I strive for the writing to kind of get out of the way. So stylistically, that's what I'm after. I admire. I kind of came to writing also through acting. I wanted to be an actor when I was very young, and have sort of kept my hand in over the years. And the actors I admire are the people who make it seem as if there's no effort at all, and yet there's a huge effort to make it seem so effortless. And I thought, if I could do that in writing, I'd be a happy man. But for voice, I kind of I always look for the humor in things, even when it's something dramatic and sometimes tragic even. And so the voice, I find myself leaning toward, always has that combination of elements in it, sometimes inappropriately, and so I have to kind of back off and revise and things like that. But I can't resist a joke, even in the moments of high tragedy. And that's both a problem and something I try to achieve. Because I think it's true for life. I mean, things are tragic, but at the same time, you think later on this is going to be very funny, but maybe not right now. Audience, I'm not sure I do. I mean, I write for people who care about people, I think, and who are interested in the struggle to be human. But that can be anybody. I don't think, it does seem to me as I get older that there is less fiction about men and women who are older, in the same way that there are fewer movies about older people. And so when they come along, like The King's Speech or something like that, interestingly, audiences show up because that's the point where true adults say, at last there's a movie for us, and Hollywood gets shocked at how many of us there are out here waiting for that kind of movie, a movie in which teenagers aren't pretending to be doctors and things like that. And in a way, a lot of fiction seems to be about younger people, and I just look for good examples of characters who are older, and so in a way, maybe lately I'm thinking more and more about readers who are older and who look back, especially with this memoir, look back and think about their lives and what's happened to them, what it's meant to them, that kind of thing. I teach creative writing, so I try and find ways to advise young writers all the time, and was just doing it before coming up here. Boy, I think I try to find three things, or urge people to find three things, and I'm still looking for them myself. And one is voice. What is your natural voice? I think a lot of developing writers try to sound like somebody else, or try to sound like what they imagine the publishing market wants, and that kind of thing. And I was like Minnesota poet Robert Bly's line. He said, the language you use in your poetry should be the language you use with your friends. I thought, that's not always true, but it's so true that I tell developing writers that, just sound like yourself. That's hard enough, And then two other things, voice and then material. What's your truest material? What subject matter do you really know? And one of the things I like about Nebraska is, I discovered it when I came to interview, and it's remained to be true, is that a lot of Nebraskans are very modest about their experience. And they say, well, I haven't been anywhere, I haven't done anything. And you talk to them, and I was just talking to a young woman a couple days ago, and I said, well, what did you do this past weekend? And she said, branding. I said, what? And she was back at her family ranch out west, and they were branding cattle that weekend. And I said, you know what? There isn't anyone else in the room, maybe in the city, who was branded in the last weekend or so. So that's your material, write about that. And it was a shock to her, She said, really? People would care about that? Yeah, they would, And then the third thing is the thing I think I can teach, which is techniques, what actual rhetorical techniques can get across voice and material in the best way. So I think if you can think of those as your goals, you're probably on the right track as a writer. Oh, I have a few things in the works. I have always too much in the works, frankly. I have a collection of stories I'm trying to finish. I need one or two more stories for, and that's been years in the making. And I have a new novel started, but it's not enough of it on paper for me to think, yes, it's true, it's a novel, and I'll stay with it. I have a few false starts that way. My wife and I write screenplays together, and we have a new one. We have one we're trying to fix, and a new one we're trying to get started. And that's a whole different side of the brain and different thing to work with someone else. So, those three things are really the big thing right now. Though the closest thing I'm kind of sprucing up is a handbook for how to write fiction that I'm finishing up based on my years of teaching. And I think it's finished, but I'm still tweaking things. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think I'm going to read a section of this memoir that is a memory of my father took me to a brush arbor service in the backwoods of Indiana when I was 7 or 8. And it was a very fundamentalist religious service that involved snake handling and the drinking of poison, and he took part in a very direct way. It's kind of haunted me all these years, and this is the first time I've ever talked about it, let alone written about it. So it's a little strange to me to be making it public. But I was 3 months ago back in this part of Indiana. It's near a little town called Gnawbone, Indiana, and it's almost the same as I remember it. I mean, it's hardly built up at all, and it's all woods. And I couldn't find the exact spot, the clearing where this service took place, but I have the feeling it's still there, and still the services are still going on. It was very rousing. Really, my first experience of religion in any respect was this very high-spirited, scary service. So I thought I'd do a little sermonizing today. Well, I'll just mention that I'm married to the writer Jonas Agee, and that makes for an interesting household. We're always arguing over who gets the pencil, and okay, not quite that, but she, I mean, she's a very, very accomplished writer, and yet we're different in interesting ways, and so I think we make a good team as far as editors for each other go too. She's hard at work on a new novel, and our biggest quarrels have to do with who's going to take the dogs out, because the other one is, you know, in the middle of a great sentence or something like that. So it makes for a lot of interesting times at home.
Good afternoon. My name is Meredith McGowan. I'm the curator of the Heritage Room, and I'd like to welcome you to the Heritage Room and to the John H. Ames reading series. We're very excited that this reading series has been in existence for more than 25 years. The Ames readings are currently held on the third Sunday of the month at 2 p.m., which you know because you're here. Thanks for being here. And this is the 196th reading, by the way. We are here in the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors. It is a special collection dedicated to promoting and preserving works by and about Nebraska authors. This is a representative collection of more than 13,000 volumes written by more than 3,000 Nebraska authors. And we also have information files and magazines and pictures, manuscripts, artwork that you can see around the room, and other memorabilia. By the way, the Heritage Room is not tax supported. It is supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, and we'd like to thank the NLHA for the endowment that they established a number of years ago through their volunteer efforts. And we do invite you to visit the room during our regular public service hours. We are open Tuesday through Friday from 12 to 3, and on Sunday from 2 to 5, and it is 2 o'clock on a Sunday, and we are open, and here we are doing the program. The Ames readings are also filmed by 5 City TV, and for those who are not here in the Heritage Room but are watching this on Channel 5, we are located on the 3rd floor of Bennett Martin Public Library at 14th and N Streets in downtown Lincoln. Our reader today is Brent Spencer. I believe Brent was born in Maryland. I hope that's true, and I'm not making that. It's true. After living in various places around the country, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Michigan, Texas, California, and I think Indiana, he has lived in Nebraska since 1992. A professor at Creighton University, is currently the director of creative writing. His own writing includes fiction, essays, and screenplays. He and his wife, Jonas Agee, have also won several awards recently, I think, for their screenplay efforts. Brent's latest book is Rattlesnake Daddy, A Son's Search for His Father, a memoir published by Backwaters Press just this month. We're very happy to have Brent with us here today, and I hope you'll please help me welcome him.
Thank you, Meredith. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate it. So many nice things to do on a great day like this, and here you are. Gee, I should take you all on a picnic after this. I'm really happy to be here. I mean, I love giving readings anyway, but this place is very special to me, and was one of the places that helped me learn whatever I know about Nebraska writers and writing, and so I really it's not every place has such a resource as this one. So I'm very glad to be a guest here. This book is true. It's a memoir. It's as true as memory and research could make it. Rattlesnake Daddy, it's a book, it's a memoir, but it's not so much about me. It's about my father, who died a little while ago, and died under mysterious circumstances. And pretty quickly after that, I started thinking about trying to figure out how he died. I mean, I knew he died in a sailing accident in Key West, but it was an accident that even the Coast Guard said was so suspicious. My father sailed. He was a lifelong well, he was retired from the Navy as a commander, but he was, sailed sailboats for many, many, many years and taught sailing. And the accident that sank his boat was one they said was only an accident the most inexperienced sailor would have made. So that made me suspicious, and the Coast Guard was suspicious. And then the more I thought about it, and as you'll see in a second, something I discovered made me realize that his whole life was a mystery, not just his death, and that I needed to find a way to figure out a way to solve the mysteries of his life and his death. So that's what the book is about. And I want to read a little bit from the first chapter to try and explain the background of what I just said, and then from a later chapter, a passage, one of my early memories of him and his influence, to try and explain what kind of man he was. I'll say now, he was a man with a lot of different personalities, and I have always admired him in many ways. I've also been afraid of him in many ways. The fact that he's now dead doesn't make me any less afraid of him. I don't know if that tells about me or about him. So from the first chapter, it was the fourth time the phone had rung in the last 10 minutes, so I broke my unbreakable rule and answered it. The unbreakable rule: never answer the phone. Not under any circumstances. Let it ring. Let it bleat. Let it call down fire from the heavens for all I cared. The phone always brought bad news. Bill collectors, angry former girlfriends, telemarketers. And besides, I had 30 freshman composition essays to grade. I could tell it was bad news. A certain glee in the ring, a certain smugness, a certain "I told you so" quality to the reverberation of the hollow afternote that hung in the air. No, I said aloud to the second set of rings, and to the third, but finally at the fourth, unable to resist, I raised the phone to my ear with all the eager dread of a man raising a gun to his head. Yeah? Brent? Yeah? Brent, it's Sherry? Yeah? He's dead. Yeah? I knew she meant our father, the man we never talked about, the man who'd been out of our lives for 30 years, but I didn't quite know what to make of the news, neither did she. I could tell from the sound of her voice sadness, yes, but more a sense of wonder, as if some eternal monument had suddenly disappeared. My father's death was the emotional equivalent of the Berlin Wall coming down. I don't quite mean that. There was no dancing in the streets. The sky wasn't filled with rocketing champagne corks. But even absent for so many years, my father still stood as a shadow, a force forever at my back. Without him in the world, the stories of his naval exploits, the memory of his madness, I was not sure I knew how to live. Toward the end of his life, after several years of living in a camper, my father moved on board a sailboat in the Florida Keys, a 46-foot, 14-ton cutter-rigged sailboat designed by Philip Rhodes and built by Kreutzer Boats in 1938. He'd sailed for years, even taught a sailing class to women, but until now he'd never owned his own boat. Its hull was made of mahogany planking over oak frames, with teak decks, white oak timbers, and bronze fastenings. Its mast, booms, and spinnaker were of Sitka spruce, the Sea Dragon. The boat had been meant to be the start of my father's new life, but in the end it killed him. His dream was to sail from place to place, meeting new people, having new experiences, but after only a few months he had that most exotic of all experiences, his own death. He drowned in a sailing accident off Key West. A lifelong sailor who had joined the Navy at 16, lying about his age, he'd never learned to swim. Since his death, I found that this is true for many career Navy men. Was it faith in technology and in his own talents that made him think he'd never need to know? Or was he just a fool who died a fool's death? Bad swimmer, bad sailor too, I guess. He hung his boat up as he entered the Northwest Channel on his way to shore, hung it on the East Jetty, the submerged wall of granite marking the passage into and out of deep water. The Coast Guard report describes the event as a, quote, collision with fixed object, a beginner's mistake, dumb. The sea was calm that night and not especially cold, but the Coast Guard had trouble responding in a timely manner, and before they could get there, the sea took him. Hypothermia, pulmonary edema, dead at 60. Some say the death is suspicious, but I guess we always say that when someone dies too soon. Our troubled history makes it impossible for me to claim his body. When I say troubled, I mean he was the kind of father who did his talking with his hands, belts, straps, a razor strop, and with his diver's knife. The kind of father who beats you for an untucked shirt, a sign that you are unworthy in the eyes of the Lord. But all that was so long ago. I've moved on. I'm an English professor in a Nebraska college. I've done fine without my father. To claim the man now, to look him in his dead face and say, yes, he's my father, it's just too much. How can I claim the man who never really claimed me? The thing is, I don't want to do anything that might be interpreted as honoring him, identifying his body, shipping him back home. My sister Sherry did it. Jumped onto a plane and flew down there to identify the body and make arrangements for its return to Indiana, the ground of his making. It's not that I'm afraid of death. That's not why I wouldn't go down there and identify the body. I'm afraid of my father, afraid that if I stood next to him, his dead body, the energy of my anger would somehow reanimate him. His dead eyelids would flutter, his stony head would turn, his gray gaze would fix on me, and once again the hammer of his hand and the hiss of his blade would rise against me. No, I didn't want to be the one to go down there. Besides, how could I identify him? I barely knew what he looked like. And anyway, he was never a father to me. To identify him now would be to participate in a charade of family life. But without warning and without fully understanding why, I drive down from my home in Nebraska to hers in New Orleans to meet her when she comes back from the Keys. I show up late at night, shamefaced, a little drunk, filled with explanations about why I couldn't go to Key West, but can be there now. As it turns out, no explanations are necessary. I knock, she pulls open the door and hauls me into the house in one swift motion, as if I'm expected, saying, "Brent, that place is beautiful." For 20 minutes she goes on about the wonders of Key West. Now, my sister is a big woman with a big heart. Her face shines as if lit from below by an armful of imaginary flowers. She's the hugger in our family. She's the one who reaches out to the rest of us. She was a runaround as a teenager, smoking with boys in the back alleys, doing other things, I guess. Maybe because she knows every trick, she keeps a firm grip on her own kids, firm but fair, like a good boxing referee. Now in her 40s, she's become a person who delights in simple pleasures. Her kids are a constant turn-on for her. The whole idea of family gives her a big kick. She is not, I mean to say, a person who takes the death of a father lightly. When she finally takes a breath, I say, "So, you identified the body?" "Yeah," she says, searching distractedly through the Polaroids for the one that catches the exact blue of the sea, the water that killed our father. "Oh, yeah," she says, showing me the picture, a blue so rich you could fill a fountain pen with it. Yeah, I did, but really, Brent, believe me, you have got to see that place." I guess you could say my father occupied an ambiguous place in our family. We, Sherry, my brother Mark, and me, are my father's first family, the one he'd pretty much erased from his mind until Sherry reached out to him 20-some years after the divorce. She tracked him down, wrote to him, called him, lured him out of the shadows, all of it on her own without a word to my brother or me. Slowly, over many months, she recultivated the relationship. After a while, he even made regular visits to her. Think Frankenstein in the woodcutter's cottage. Tonight, after she runs out of things to say about the splendors of Key West, she says, as if apologizing for the absence of grief, "We didn't really know him very well." This doesn't say as much about her as it does about him, about the essential mystery of the man, about the distance he kept between himself and the world. And now here he is, dead, the undiscovered country of my father. "There's something else," Sherry says, putting down her pictures and leading me out to the empty carport, where she stacked a half-dozen bulging green garbage bags. Most of this was still on the boat, she said, but the salvage company had to fish a lot of it right out of the sea. Most of what? His garbage? His papers. What papers? All of them. And when I still didn't get it, everything, she said. I kneeled down to the nearest bag, spread open its mouth, take in the rank scent of seawater, and peel up the top sheet of paper, a letter from my father to his doctor dated more than 2 decades ago. a copy he made by hand in his careful squared-off printing. Dear Dr. Sorensen, you treated me recently for a skin condition which I have had for 29 years. It has been called nomular eczema, and you called it winter itch. I remember the handwriting vividly from my childhood, the dead-even lines, the words not inscribed so much as erected. I look up startled, expecting to see him standing there in the carport, about to wail on me for going through his stuff. But it's just Sherry and me and the sea-smelling bags of swollen paper, hundreds and hundreds of sheets, bales of it, pounds and pounds of pages fished up from the sea, checkbook ledgers, diary pages, letters, recipes, shopping lists, reminders, class notes, lecture notes, every piece of paper that had ever passed through his hands. Have you gone through all this? I said. I had a look. It's mostly old receipts, stuff like that. I show her the letter I've been reading, the blue ink fuzzy with dampness. Not words at all, but the ghosts of words, the bones of thought. Yeah, she says, handing it back. Winter itch, I say, tugging my pant leg. He's describing the exact same rash I have on my leg. Yeah, so? She isn't getting it. And I'm not sure I can explain it. My heart's pounding, but I keep myself calm. Well, I just think it's interesting is all. But it's more than that. That rash is a connection as real as a fingerprint, as revealing as DNA. My father and I suffered from the same skin condition. At last I found something that ties me to the man. The realization fills me with an exhilarating mixture of pleasure and disgust. Maybe I am my father's son after all. For the rest of the night, I sit on the floor of the carport, carefully lifting wet slabs of paper out of the bags, peeling back the layers like some kind of archaeologist. Along about dawn, I come across a thick, wet sheaf of pages stapled along one side, a journal in the same careful printing, the Mexico log of Commander R.C. Spencer. Along with his impressions, private thoughts, price comparisons, and lists of necessities, the log includes detailed maps of his routes, the places he stayed, the people he met. I knew that for the last 10 years or so of his life, ever since his second marriage ended, he lived in a camper. Now I know that he spent a good deal of that time lurking along the U.S.-Mexico border, a place I've always thought of as mine. Was he somewhere nearby that last time I went to Nuevo Laredo? Or was he walking in the street below that balcony bar in Tijuana? Or was he following me? He might have been. According to his log, he was in both of these places when I was there, and many more besides. The thought that we might have passed each other in a Mexican street makes the connection between us seem more real than a rash. Like twins separated at birth, we suffered the same ailments, felt drawn to the same landscapes. We were closer, I now realize, than I ever thought possible. The new day is gearing up. I can hear noises from the neighbor's house, heavy, clomping footsteps on the stairs, the chatter of the radio. By the time Sherry puts on the first pot of coffee, I know what I have to do. I have to go back to the border, to the places he went, have to look for signs of him, clues to his mystery. When Sherry brings me a cup of coffee, she shakes her head at the blizzard of paper. Every square inch of the carport is covered with old receipts, letters, photographs, calendar pages, and more. I tell her my plan. It's all here. I can't keep the excitement out of my voice. I hold the damp journal in front of her face as if it's a treasure map. The places he went, the people he talked to, not just in the journal, but in lots of these pages. I spread my hands over my night's work. Damp, translucent sheets of paper are spread out all over the floor of the carport. From the look on her face, you'd think I'd turned into a maniac, and maybe I have. She looks doubtfully at the carport full of paper. The body's already on its way back to Indiana, she says. If you make this trip, you'll miss the funeral. I haven't thought about that. Then I'll have to miss the funeral, I say. But why, she says. Why now? Why go now? Why not wait till after the funeral? You're his son, the oldest. Because, like identifying the body, going to the funeral is one more thing I can't bring myself to do. You drive your kid away with boards, belts, blades, and the hard calloused flat of your hand, and now you want that same kid to claim you, to grieve over you, to stand at the graveside and cry hot tears into the open hole? No. Or maybe going to the border is my way of honoring his memory, or at least of trying to recapture the man, restore him to us, the story of his life, the story of my life, at least a part of it, his days on the line between worlds. Yes, that's the pretty spin to give it. I can't do it, Sherry, I say. I can't be there. I can't do the grieving family thing. I can't sit there and listen to all the relatives say what a great guy he was when I know he would let it go. I can't. Sherry looks at me a little sideways, on the verge of speech, but she knows better than to try to talk me out of it. She has her own history with my father. Going to the funeral would show respect for a man who doesn't deserve it. Guess I'll show him. My message is actually meant for the family, who worshipped him his whole life. I want them to know that someone else in the family has a different view. I want my absence and my silence to drown out their false praise, their meaningless sorrow. Guess I'll show them. What a child I am. I could avoid lots of mental anguish by just claiming the body, yes, that's him, and dragging it back to the farmlands of his making. I think I'm depriving him of honor, but maybe all I'm doing is depriving myself of something vastly more important. But what that is, I don't really know yet. So instead of going to the funeral, I load up the trunk of my Taurus with the heavy green garbage bags filled with his past, thick, moldy, sea-smelling bales of it. They're so heavy and smell so bad that as I lift them into the car, the green plastic bags going drum-tight, tighter, it's all I can do to keep from thinking I'm hoisting hunks of his actual body into the trunk. In a way, I guess I am. I don't know what more I'll find among his papers, or if I'll find anything at all. I just know I have to move, have to retrace his steps, have to find a clear space to rethink everything I think I know about my father and about myself. So that's what sent me on a trip that lasted 2 months along the border, trying to track down people he knew, mostly servicemen that he served on various ships with. I found a lot of them. I got some answers, but I'm never quite sure. There are more questions than answers, which is probably always going to be the way. I want to jump to a later part of the book, though, to try and explain in a way or demonstrate what he was like as a man. And I always think, though I don't have proof of this, that this episode may have been one reason one of many reasons my parents got divorced. He took me one night to a brush arbor service. I'm not sure if you know what that is, but for some Pentecostals, services take place, not a real church. I don't think it has any name in that sense. It's certainly no building. They take place in various parts of the woods or country. I think you'll hear the description in a second. But and they believe in that line, which I think is in Revelations, that the faithful will be able to be bit by snakes and drink poison and not die. And that's evidence of your election to eternity. And my father was part of this church, though we didn't know it at the time. And he took me to a service back in the woods. So I want to kind of share with you what that service was like. One hot Sunday in July, back in Indiana, without telling my mother, he took me to a brush arbor revival meeting. My father didn't take us on outings, least of all me by myself. So this was something special. I knew this, and I made a point of being on my best behavior, sitting in the exact center of the passenger seat, sitting silently, my hands folded in my lap. I didn't want to do anything that would unleash the animal in him. But more than that, I wanted my father to be proud of me. I wanted this to be the first of many times my father took me on outings, just the two of us. Maybe the bad times, the hard hand and voice were over. Maybe tonight was the first step in showing me that I was worthy of his love. It was a hot night full of locusts and spinning with stars. The heat was worse inside the arbor, even though the thing was little more than an arrangement of stout poles with a roof of pine boughs. Wooden folding chairs were set out in the dirt to hold the 30 or 40 people who had come. We came in at the back and took seats somewhere toward the middle on the right side of the aisle. The front of the seating area was a cleared space with a wicker trunk sitting in the center. "What's that?" I asked, pointing. They were the first words I'd spoken since getting into the car. It looked like an old steamer trunk, as if someone's grandma had left her luggage. Didn't she know the sermon was about to start? Don't point, he said. And then the old woman sitting in front of us turned around. I could see makeup caked in the cracks of her face. You, little man, is too young to handle, too young to be bathed in the blood. I tell you what, you ain't too young to get right, boy. You hearing me? Get right now. Yes, ma'am, I said, not knowing what she was talking about, but wanting to treat her with the respect my father said elders deserved. She turned her gaze to my father for a moment. You raising him right? Yes, ma'am. I'm raising him by the good book and the good belt. She smiled. I knowed that, just looking at you. Then she brought her eyes back to me, her gaze narrowing, boring into me. Choose Jesus, boy. You hear? Yes, ma'am. Insects whirled drunkenly in the air overhead. I liked Jesus. Jesus was all right with me. To me, the preacher looked ancient, though he was probably only about 50, a heavy man who already had big shadows of sweat under his white sleeves, even before he began huffing and puffing for Jesus. He wore a skinny black tie and black pants slick with wear. His collar was buttoned so tight his face was red, or maybe it was the Jesus already coming into him. He started talking before everyone had taken a seat. There's a seat up front, he said quietly to a latecomer. He's just a normal person, like a teacher. Horace, how's that corn coming? As more people came into the arbor, he talked about the weather and crops and how the people were good to come out to hear him when he was nothing but a sinner himself, but a sinner who had heard the word and got himself right with Jesus. All this he said in a quiet, conversational voice, farmers talking over a fence. About the time everybody was seated and settled down, he began to pace slowly back and forth in this bare space before the chairs. He'd stop and stare off into the trees outside, then shake his head and pace again. He began to talk to himself, low at first, like he'd forgotten anyone else was there, like he had a problem he was trying to work out, like he was trying to remember something. And then he stopped and turned to us. He had a strange smile, a widening of the mouth that had nothing of pleasure in it. His eyes were dead gray beams. If anything, the smile made him look as though he had smelled something bad, the stench of sin, I guess. It didn't seem to bother him that someone's trunk was sitting right in the middle of things. In fact, as he talked, he walked around it, slapped at it, stroked it. The sweat stains in his white shirt deepened. It ain't the sinner God hates, he said. It's the sin. But if you have not fessed up to your sinfulness, then, dear ones, you are nothing more than sin itself. You are sin. Walking, talking sin. He loosened his tie and unbuttoned his collar, giving relief to his rubbery neck. He shook his head. But lay your heavy heart at the feet of the Redeemer, and ye shall know peace everlasting, glory everlasting. Repent, remit, and relax into the ever-loving arms of Jesus Christ. And then he waded in among the chairs. Heads turned. A flash of surprise swept the crowd. The wooden chairs creaked. Now, Faust Funeral Home, I swear, was stenciled on the backs of the chairs. This is true. As he moved among us, the preacher yelled, "A tree shall be known by the fruit it bears." And then he turned and charged through the chairs to the other side of the arbor. A wing of his black hair fell into his eyes. He flopped it back with a jerk of his head. Did you hear me, dear ones? Jesus said, I'm the vine, ye are the branches. Ye cannot bear fruit in yourself, but I throw my own self into the branch. And what kind of fruit did it bear? He darted quickly to another part of the crowd. These signs shall follow them that believe. As he spoke, as he worked himself up, his shirt tail came dangerously close to working itself completely out of his pants, a whipping offense in my father's eyes. This made it hard for me to concentrate on what he was saying, even if I could understand it. I tucked my own shirt in deeper. Let the preacher get the whipping, I thought, fully expecting my father to take him over his knee. But he just sat there smiling, my father, his eyes following the preacher, who swept back and forth among the crowd. A tree shall be known by the fruit it bears. By now we were all turning in our seats, trying to follow him with our eyes, trying to swing our knees out of the way so he could come charging by. The chairs ached under us as we swung back and forth, and some closed their eyes and raised their faces, holding out their palms, swaying lightly. And then he ran to the back where it was hard to see him at all, and his voice came booming, "A tree shall be known by the fruit it bears, and honey, I'm a fruit picker." There was a chorus of praise Jesus. Someone somewhere began to weep. He made his way back to the front, yanking on his tie like he was leading an old horse back to the stable. But the closer he got to the front of the crowd, the slower he walked. He shook his head, and the air seemed to go out of him by the second. "I'd be lying if I didn't tell you my thoughts are heavy tonight," he said. "There's a heavy hand on my heart, and I just don't know what to do about it." There was a shuffling in the crowd, a current of whispering. One lady meekly said, "Try Jesus." But the preacher didn't seem to hear her, lost in his thoughts. My father stiffened, his eyes on the preacher, who circled the wicker trunk, stopped in front of it, shook his head, and kept walking. He stopped and looked at us like he had just noticed us, like we were old friends catching up. He said, "You know that feeling when there's something keeping your spirit down? Like you're being bug squashed under a heavy boot? Truth is, that's what I'm feeling right now." He started pacing again. A man's voice shot up in the crowd, "Jesus will help you." A couple others agreed that he would, but the preacher wasn't going for it. He sighed heavily and slowly slapped his heart with a loose fist. He shook his head. "Ain't nothing for it," he said. "Time to face facts. This old preacher's gone bust." A murmur of reassurance ran through the crowd. "No, no," people said. I turned to see a big old woman in a faded dress stand up, clutching the back of the seat in front of her. She was trembling, and she was shaking. She just stood there looking at the preacher, her eyes all wet with tears. The preacher paid no attention to any of it. "I'm telling you, dear ones," he said, slapping his heart again, "it's time to face facts. Nothing'll grow in dirt this dead." His shoulders slumped, and it looked like it was hard for him to hold up his head. "I'm done for, folks." He started walking up the aisle toward the back end of the arbor. As he walked, he buttoned his shirt, straightened his tie. He was leaving us. "You want my honest advice? You go get yourself a decent preacher," he said. "One still got some sap in him." More people protested quietly, saying, "No, no." A man in overalls stood up and began to mutter words I couldn't understand, his hands flying out like frightened birds. When I looked up at my father, his eyes were still on the preacher, but he was shaking his head no. His movements measured, precise, strangely without emotion. A young woman moved into the aisle in front of the preacher, blocking his way. She was shaking, hardly able to stand. Her knees began to buckle, but an older woman caught her from behind and lifted her back up. The young woman's head rolled onto her shoulder. Her eyes rolled back into her head. I was scared. I said, "Is she dying, Daddy?" For the first time since we'd sat down, he looked at me. A long second passed, almost as if he were trying to remember who I was. And then he said, "The Lord's working on her in mystery ways." The preacher took the young woman by the chin and looked into her eyes. His voice was strained. "I can't help you, precious." He stepped around her and headed for the back of the tent and the clearing and the dark woods beyond. But some people from the back of the arbor stood up and locked arms to keep the preacher from leaving, then turned him back toward the front of the arbor and the wicker trunk. The preacher's eyes were steamy with held-back tears. "Don't you see, dear ones? I can't do it no more. I don't have it in me." He slapped his chest again, then he swept his arm out to include the crowd. Maybe this tree has no more fruit. Maybe this field's been picked over." The man in front was shouting out noises like coyote barks. The preacher looked around at us, trying to bring us into focus. Now, I ain't trying to get your mind going here, but maybe I'm not worthy to be your preacher. Maybe I've lost my fire." People had risen halfway to their feet now and were rattling their empty chairs, crying, "No, no! If there's only somebody to help me," he said. "If there's only somebody to take this burden off of me." More faint cries, "Jesus! Jesus!" He was edging back toward the front of the arbor now. "If I could just find somebody to do my work for me, why, dear ones, I'd be a happy man." "Jesus!" Louder now. He was at the middle of the aisle, and he bent over, leaning his head to the side. What's that you say?" "Jesus! Jesus!" the crowd hissed. He held his cupped hand behind his ear. "Jesus," he said, matter-of-factly, "is that what you're saying? You're saying there's a fella named Jesus who's willing to lend a hand to this old fruit picker?" "Yes, Jesus!" It was the woman in front of us, the woman whose face was caked with makeup. She stood up when he was near and held her hands out, clutching at the air. "Jesus will lend you a hand." But he walked right past her, still puzzling it out. Because I would purely love to have somebody do my work for me here on this hot night. Jesus will help you." He was back in front of the congregation now. He looked around at us. He thought about the offer. He swept his hair back in place with one hand. He loosened his tie again, yanked it. "No," he said, shaking his head. I don't think so. No Jesus." He circled the trunk once and faced the crowd again. "Nope. No Jesus." The chairs stopped creaking. No one spoke. Even the people waiting for the rapture opened their eyes a crack, afraid they'd stumbled into Satan's tent. And then, louder, the preacher said slowly, "No Jesus." And then louder still, his voice a raw blade. "Do you hear me, dear ones? I said, no Jesus." The congregation began to stir. This was not what they'd come for. Not at all what they'd come for. But the preacher seemed not to notice. He began to pace. "Now, Jesus was sleeping on a coil of rope, and the wind was blowing and the waves was going. To and fro the disciples ran, to and fro. Oh, what are we going to do? Oh, what shall we do? And the waves was going and the wind was blowing. I know, they said, let's wake up old Jesus, the Son of God. And so they ran to Jesus. Do you hear me, dear ones? Are you listening? They ran to the Son of God while the wind was blowing and the waves was going. And you know what they did? They cried out to Jesus. They flapped their hands and pranced around. The preacher flapped his hands and pranced around, his knees pumping high. They said, Jesus, you got to help us. Jesus, you got to help us. And you know what old Jesus did, dear ones? While the wind was blowing and the waves was going, he stirred from his bed of rope, from his bed of sorrow, from his bed of pain. And he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and he looked up at the disciples gathered all around, and he said, do I have to help you guys with every little thing? The space inside the tent was a caught breath. His voice now was a high whine. Do you see, my precious ones? Do you feel the dawn coming on? Sometimes you got to do for yourself. Sometimes you got to bear your own burden, shoulder your own cross. Sometimes you got to leave Jesus asleep on his coil of rope. He'd worked his way behind the trunk now and with a sudden jump flung it open. Only one way to know, the preacher said, working himself up, slapping his heart now. Only one way to tell. His words now riding the back of a droning incantation. And by these signs will you believe. In my name you will cast out demons. You will speak in new tongues. If you pick up serpents, they will not hurt you. If you drink the deadly thing, you will not die. You will lay hands on the sick and they shall recover. His words now a sharp shout. So the Bible says, so the Bible says, so the Bible says. Even with the other woman's help, the woman in the aisle went down again, this time to the ground. She rolled around there, her back arched, digging at the dirt with her feet until her flat black shoes came off. And still she twisted and turned, her hands flying down between her legs and then up again, her neck sprung back, her eyes rolling. The preacher pulled his tie clean off now and unbuttoned his shirt more, showing his swollen neck wet with sweat. I ain't playing church with you now, dear ones. I ain't schooling you. I ain't giving you no psalm-singing Sunday sermon. I'm flat out telling you. Sometimes there ain't nothing for it but to grab the devil by the throat. He thrust his arm deep into the trunk and came up with a coiling handful of snakes, tails whipping, heads lashing. I don't remember much of what he said after that. I couldn't take my eyes off the snakes. He held them in the air, he shook them, he clutched them to his chest, scrubbing them all over with them. The crowd cried out, yes, oh yes! He talked about Jeremiah in the pit, about being stuck in the pit and trying to climb the sides of the pit, but the sides are too slick and you never get out because the pit is sin and the pit is wickedness and you are trapped forever in the pit because you are an ungrateful sinner and they done digged a pit for thy soul and set snares for thy wicked feet. And then for a moment his voice went all soft, but precious ones, you can't never stop trying to get your name in the Lamb's Book of Life. And then with his free hand, he tore his shirt open and scrubbed his bare chest with the snakes. He reached into the box with his other hand, coming up with another handful of writhing, coiling death. He shook the snakes in the air and said, "In my name they shall cast out devils." That's what he said. He pointed his coiling fist at the crowd. Are you ready to do that, dear ones? Are you ready to do his work? Do his work. Don't let him do your work. My God's a do-it-yourself kind of guy. Are you ready for Jesus Christ, the Son of God? Are you ready for Jesus Christ, the light everlasting? Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Hands were raised to the heavens. Tearful faces were raised to God. People fell to the ground, shaking and rolling and jabbering. The woman in front of us turned and with tears in her eyes said, "They shall speak in tongues unknown. He's opening up now. You never seen nothing bad out of that man. He's fame known." My father gave her a stingy little nod. Some of the snakes were thick and brown, like things that had oozed up from the bowels of the earth. Some were smaller, only the diameter of jump ropes, but they whipped and twisted, slick with evil. Lots of people were up on their feet now, dancing, whirling, stomping, and calling out in wild, inconsolable jabber songs. The woman who had been rolling on the ground was up now and moving toward the front, to a table off to the side, where she drank from a stoppered glass bottle. As soon as she did that, she staggered against one of the arbor poles, clutched it, scraped her face against the rough bark. Her eyes were closed, but tears came pouring from under her lashes, and from her mouth came a mournful yodel. A man from down our aisle stood up, his arms upraised and holding a long snake as big around as the inner tube on my Huffy. He must have brought it with him. Until then, my father sat unmoved next to me, his head held high, the angle of his crew cut parallel with the earth. But now he jerked to his feet like a hooked trout and knocked chairs aside as he staggered toward the front of the tent. He leaned over the open basket and plunged his hand in deep, turning a dead-eyed gaze on me. When his hand came out, he was holding a quick coiling length of red fire. He took it in both hands, moving his grip to just below the head. The foot-long snake lashed itself around his wrist and then let loose. When he raised the head to his face, the snake's jaws went wide, its tongue stabbing. And then my father took the whole head, the gaping jaws and flashing tongue, into his mouth. He held it like that, gazing at me with calm eyes. The snake went crazy, whipping itself against his face, twisting, throbbing, demon's tongue. My father didn't even blink. I was scared unto very death. I'd been scared from the minute the woman in front of us told me I had to take a bath in blood. And even earlier when I'd heard the locusts whine, and earlier still when after supper my father had taken my hand and said, "It's time I taught you something about sin." And before that, more afraid than I had ever been on any of those nights when my father's belt lashed the sin out of me, the pain second to the fear, his big voice booming, "Jesus Christ, the Lord of heaven! Jesus Christ, the Lord of hosts!" By now the crowd was a swaying, screaming mob. Women tore at their clothes. Men jumped like they'd tasted lightning. The preacher kept preaching, his voice lilting then loud, and through it all my father stood there with the snake in his mouth, telling me things with his eyes. The preacher said, "Oh, dear ones, oh, precious things. When he comes back, he ain't coming as a little baby in a manger. No, sir. When he comes back, precious, you're going to know about it. You are going to know about it. And you know what? He ain't coming back nailed upon the cross. No, sir. And no, he ain't going to come back as the one who laid in the tomb. No, sir. Lord of Lords and King of Kings, he coming back on a big white horse with a sword raised on high. Yes, sir. He coming back to do battle on the fields of Armageddon in the valley of Jehoshaphat. He coming back to call call down fire, and he will come charging with his sword held on high. Yes, sir. And on that field the blood will run, and on that field the blood will run as high as a horse's bridle on that day, on that day. Is this the day? Is this the day? Is this the day the Lord is coming back? Is this the day the Lord is coming back? Is this the day? And are you ready, dear ones? Are you? Are you ready? Lest ye be tested by fire, tested by serpents, tested by the deadly thing. You ain't ready. You ain't ready. You ain't ready. Jesus knows, the preacher said. Yes, Jesus knows. He knows the world. He knows this hard place. And he knows your heart is sore from this hard place, from the world. And that's a hard place. But can you lift your heart? Won't you lift your heart? Won't you lift your heart to Jesus and say, I am here, Jesus Christ, the Lord of heaven. I am here, Jesus Christ, the Lord of hosts. I am here, Jesus Christ, the Lord of heaven and of earth, the Lord, I say, of this dark place. And Jesus, won't you take? And Jesus, won't you take? And Jesus, won't you take and catch me into the life everlasting? Just then it began to rain. At first a shimmer blowing past like a curtain caught in a breeze. Then big, flat, slopping drops that came pouring through the crossed branches overhead. The preacher dropped the snakes back into the wicker basket and walked down the aisle. Come on, dear ones, he said, waving us along with him. Come unto the anointing. When my father took the snake out of his mouth, it coiled around his fist. He had to shake it off into the basket. He came back to me slowly, his eyes on me and on me and on me. We followed the preacher out into the rain, those of us who weren't still jerking like live things on a spit. He stepped out into the clearing and raised his arms, his face, so the rain could hit him square. He turned slowly, his face raised to the night sky. There were tears in his voice. When we believe in the rapture, when we believe in the rapture, when we believe in the rapture, well done, my good and faithful servant, washed in the blood of the Lamb, well done. A flash of lightning lit our upturned faces, and the rain fell like cold blades, and then the preacher saw the rest of us as if for the first time. Even though the rain was coming down hard now, his face relaxed into a benign smile. His whole body relaxed. He was wet all over now. We all were, but we didn't seem to notice it. It was like the simple farmer had come back. He waved us toward him, his children, called us in, and we gathered close around him. With the rain coming down so hard, the spray bounced up off the ground as high as my knees. My father's big hand fell to my back, the back of my neck, and he pushed me until I was right next to the preacher, right up against him. Everybody was crushing in on him, all the wet bodies. The preacher looked down at me and he said, "That's right, son. Come on, get in here close and get you some of this anointing all over you. Rain, that's the poor man's holy oil." He gathered us close in and looked into each of our faces while the rain drummed down. When a streak of lightning splashed across the sky, chants and cries flew up into the stormy darkness, and I saw my father was looking down at me, his eyes bright with the mystery. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.